Welcome for the sun today for the 8th of January 2022. We have lots to talk about today. We have some sunspots, a couple of flares, no significant coronal mass ejections. The solar wind seems to be changing a little bit, and that's affecting geospace. And we're going to talk about a question raised by one of the viewers. Why is the activity concentrated mainly in the southern hemisphere so far this cycle? We have some fairly dynamic sunspots on the sun at the moment. The region 2924 is the largest region, and it showed quite a bit of change since yesterday. Here's yesterday's picture, and you can see that there's been a great deal of change, particularly in the middle of the region. Those two blue areas seem to have been decaying quite significantly. Meanwhile, these other two areas moved towards their respective main spots. There's a new region appearing in the northern hemisphere. That's why I've got it as a dashed square on there. It's got a few sunspots there at the moment, but I'm hoping that it will steadily grow. The region yesterday that I hoped might grow is in fact decaying somewhat, and it's just a single small spot left. Similarly, the region following it, just a couple of small spots and much weaker than it was yesterday. Then, of course, there's active region 2925, which seems stable. It hasn't changed very much over the last 24 hours. The official sunspot number has increased slightly since yesterday, but quite a bit over the last Carrington rotation. This time last month, it was at 0 sunspot number, and now we're at 50. Meanwhile, the X-ray flux is remaining relatively high, though it has decayed a bit since yesterday. We got two more C flares. They're marked here in the black font. The two grey ones on here were the ones that we talked about yesterday. We had one just before midnight UT and one just after, both in region 2924. So let's take a look at some movies. First of all, we'll take a look at the sunspot movie, and I particularly want you to take a look at active region 2924 and how the sunspots evolve. Next, we'll look at flare movies from the SDO AIA instrument, and we're going to look at the Iron 18 movie at about 6.4 million degrees Kelvin. The flashes here are flares. Last but not least, we're going to look for coronal mass ejections using the SOHO LASCO coronagraph for the last couple of days. The solar wind actually has been quiet and is likely to remain so. However, there has been a little bit of activity in it. If you look at the BZ component, that's the vertical component of the magnetic field, you see there has been an excursion to the south, which is a possibility for reconnection in the Earth magnetosphere. The density has increased quite significantly to about 30 particles per cubic centimeter, up by a factor of 10 since yesterday. The speed has increased a little bit, but is still not particularly notable, being less than 350 kilometers per second. And the temperature has increased slightly too, up to about 70,000 degrees Kelvin, but again, not particularly notable compared with normal. As I said, GEOSPACE is showing a bit more activity. The KP index got up to 2 recently, after remaining at near 0 for basically 2 days. However, 2 is nothing to write home about, so I'm looking for something more like 4 or 5 before I start getting excited about what's going on there. So why is most of the activity in the south? First of all, is it mostly in the south? This is a plot of the sunspot number by hemisphere. Green here shows an excess of sunspot in the northern hemisphere. Red shows an excess of sunspots in the southern hemisphere. And you can see for most of the previous cycles, we've started the cycle off with the northern hemisphere and ended it mainly with the southern hemisphere. The one exception to this is the solar cycle 22, which started off with the southern hemisphere being dominant, but it's again ended with it being the northern hemisphere in control, at least until the maximum occurred. Now this solar cycle 25 is doing a similar sort of thing. The southern hemisphere is by far the dominant hemisphere as far as magnetic field production is concerned. Well, not only is the northern hemisphere less active than the southern hemisphere, there's one whole side of the sun that's less active than the other. Here are two images of the sun taken 2 weeks apart. So here on the left, we have an image taken on the 21st of December, and you can see it's very, very active. And then 2 weeks later, on the 4th of January, when the exact opposite face of the sun is facing us, you see we have hardly anything. Now this has happened before, I've noticed, in previous cycles, and eventually breaks down, but at the moment we have a happy sun and an unhappy sun on opposite sides of the sun. So really what we have here is a strong southern hemisphere on one side of the sun and a moderately strong southern hemisphere on the other side of the sun. It isn't bereft of sunspots. In the northern hemisphere on the strong face, we have moderate activity, probably more so than the opposite face in the southern hemisphere. But in the northern hemisphere for that side, we have a very, very weak sunspot record. There's hardly anything major there. Now, as time goes by, these activity regions will expand and move towards the equator. But at the moment, this is the situation we're in and could last for several months. It reminds me somewhat of the oscillation results of helioseismology on the sun. The sun vibrates like a bell, and there are certain modes that activate certain parts of the sun, or could activate certain parts of the sun. Here are some of the vibrational modes that you can get on the sun, and I think this might be very, very similar to what we're seeing at the moment, particularly the one in the bottom left. So maybe these sunspot activities are being stimulated by the vibrational modes of the sun. This is just a speculation on my part. I have nothing to prove that this is the case. It's just an interesting hypothesis. So what conclusions can we draw? We have a tale of two hemispheres, not just the north and the south, but we also have the front and the back of the sun as potential differences in levels of activity. We have two new regions coming over the east limb at the moment, and the sunspots from those should be visible either later today or tomorrow. We've had low flare activity, just a couple of small C flares in the last 24 hours. There have been no major coronal mass ejections. The solar wind is showing quite some variability at the moment, although that has not translated into any major variations in the magnetosphere. So until next time, stay safe and goodbye.